Okay, so I want to start with a thought, and this thought, if I haven't shared it already, is that people are scumbags. People are scumbags. People are rationally self-interested. People will lie to you. There are all sorts of things people do because people in general are selfish, and we say rationally self-interested because it's just how the human nature because of evolution. Think about this. If your ancestors had been so friendly and loving that they gave away all their food to the other members of the tribe, would you be here today? No, they would have starved to death before they could reproduce, or at the very least, their children would starve to death and would not reproduce, so you wouldn't be here. So the only reason that we're here is because every single one of our ancestors down the line has been rationally self-interested. They kind of took care of themselves first, and then others second. And so that's, when I say people are scumbags, I just say that for effect, but we're rationally self-interested. And we're going to see what that means in our impacts of the capital structures of the firm. Let's talk about the costs of financial distress. What is financial distress? Is that a good thing? No, that's when you're in financial trouble. And financial distress precedes bankruptcy. It doesn't always lead to bankruptcy. But if you are in a bad financial way, that's financial distress. What if it does go to bankruptcy? Then we have what are called direct costs. And those are our legal and administrative costs. By the way, lawyers are attracted to bankruptcies the way that sharks are attracted to blood in the water. Why? Because they get paid well to do these bankruptcies. And so we know we're going to have to pay the lawyers, and that value is not going to go to the bondholders, it's not going to go to the shareholders, it's going to go to the lawyers. We also know that we have to have what's called a bankruptcy trustee, and that person has to be paid as well. They're the one overseeing the whole bankruptcy procedure, and then there's court costs and all that. And so those are what we call the direct costs of bankruptcy, and you might think those would be relatively easy to measure, and perhaps they are, but there are these other costs called indirect costs of bankruptcy or of financial distress. So let's talk about a company called Linens and Things. So before Bed Bath & Beyond took a dump, there was another competitor in that same space called Linens and Things. And Linens and Things, the word got out that they were in financial distress. Now, what do you think the suppliers started doing? By the way, in business, are we selling for cash or are we selling on credit? Yeah, typically we're selling on credit. And so what do you think the suppliers suddenly started demanding from Linens and Things once they heard that things weren't quite good at Linens and Things? Yeah, payment up front. And so now, Linens and Things, by the way, they were short on cash, is why they're in trouble. Are they able to pay cash for these supplies? No. And so it really damaged the relationship with their suppliers, and it limited what they had on their shelves. Usually you walk into these joints, and you guys hopefully have been to Bed Bath & Beyond just once to be able to see what a horrible experience it was. These things are stacked to the gills with inventory. Well, if you go in there and there's no inventory, how do you buy anything? You're in a world of trouble, right? So not only do they have now no inventory, they've got no sales, and if you've got no sales, you've got no profits. And so everything starts to go horribly, horribly wrong for Linens and Things. So these lost sales, or the supply chain is one thing. What about lost sales? Let's talk about a couple of companies here. Do you guys know about Rivian? What does Rivian make?
Electric vehicles.
Electric vehicles. Let's talk about the other company that's in this space. It's a new one, and I forget this is how bad it is. It's a company.
Lucid too.
Okay, so there's Lucid. So let's just compare Rivian and Ford. They both sell electric pickup trucks. Did you guys know that? Now, what if the word got out that Rivian was on shaky ground financially, and you're trying to decide between buying a Rivian and buying a Ford? How does that impact your decision?
Probably don't buy a Rivian.
You probably don't buy a Rivian. So I've got this neighbor, and he's a lovely man, bought one of those Rivian pickup trucks, and it's cool. Oh my goodness, it's cool. And I'm looking at it, and my wife and I walked away, and I'm like, I wonder if the company will survive long enough to honor the entire warranty. Is it hard to break into the car company thing? Yeah. But that's a potential there. So if I were going to buy an electric pickup truck, I'd be buying a Ford because I would be concerned that perhaps a young company like Rivian might not be able to make the cut. So that's another one of these impacts, is that you lose sales. And then there's also just the general reputation. Think about General Motors. You guys probably were younger children when they went bankrupt, but people would derisively refer to them as government motors because before they died totally, the government bailed them out. Now that reputational impact, do you think that helped their sales or hurt them? Yeah, it definitely hurt them. And I still have a bad taste in my mouth with them and with what is now Stellantis, with the deals that they got during all of that. Ford, by the way, did not take any bailouts. So guess what happened to Ford sales there for at least a while? Their sales were greater than those other two simply because they didn't have that sting on them. Okay, so now let's talk about the agency problem. The agency problem is when basically you handle other people's resources differently than you would handle your own. And so you are more concerned about your cash flows than someone else's. And by the way, that's human nature, right? And we're going to talk about 3 scumbag strategies here. First of all, there's the incentive to take large risks. Look forward here. Okay, so we've got the incentive to take large risks. Let's think about a bank. And the bank is in trouble. And the bank is going to go insolvent. We know the bank is going to fail. Now, what do we mean by insolvent? The company's assets will not be enough to cover the liabilities, which means that the shareholders will get nothing. So the shareholders know they're going to get nothing. And so what are they incentivized to do? What if someone comes along and asks them for a $1 billion loan? It's extraordinarily risky, but it's going to pay an interest rate of 20%. What do you think the bank managers are going to do? They're going to make that loan, right? Because after all, if the loan pays off, then the shareholders get to keep some money and the bank gets to stay in business and the managers get to keep their jobs. What if the loan goes bad? Does it hurt the shareholders?
They don't have anything to lose.
Yeah, who takes it on the chin? So there's equity and there's debt.
That's the one.
Yeah, if there's no equity left to burn through, who takes it on the chin?
That whole-
The debt holders. Who are the debt holders at a bank? The depositors. The depositors. Now we've got deposit insurance here in this country, so we're protecting the depositors. But then who takes it on the chin?
Everybody.
Everybody, because we all pay. Anybody who's got a bank account here, you would be getting more return on your money at the bank if they didn't have to pay that FDIC insurance premium. Furthermore, do you think the FDIC always has enough money to cover all of these things when they go? No! So who ends up taking it on the nose? Taxpayers, right? The taxpayers do. And so this is basically a scumbag move where you are going to make this big bet, and if you win, so it's heads I win, tails you lose. Isn't that cool? So I don't lose if this thing goes sideways, but if it turns out okay, then I win. By the way, the debt holders would be better off if you didn't make the bet. And we're going to give you a numerical example of how that works. And then there is the incentive toward underinvestment. And we'll also give an example of this, but here's the idea. if I have to, as shareholders, if I have to put in additional equity to take on a positive NPV project, and it turns out that it's going to probably help the bondholders more than the shareholders. Why? Because the bondholders get paid first. Does that make sense? And so basically, if this positive NPV project was just enough to keep the company from going insolvent, it wouldn't make sense for me to go ahead and invest that extra money. And so we say that's underinvestment, even though that's a positive NPV project. By the way, what do we say about positive NPV projects? We should always accept them, right? We should always do them. In fact, the goal of financial management is maximize shareholder wealth. But what we're seeing here is sometimes accepting positive NPV projects doesn't always maximize shareholder wealth. And we'll give you an example of how that works. And then finally, there's milking the property. Milking the property. So, what do you think that means? Let's talk about cows. Do you guys know anything about cows? Anybody here come from the farm? No farm people? Oh my goodness, let me tell you how cows work. So, milk cows, they have to be milked twice a day, morning and night. And those cows just keep spitting out milk. Well, not actually spitting. They keep squirting out milk day after day after day. And so we're milking the cow. Now, what's the cow getting out of this? I got cold hands. She's probably not digging it, right? Never mind. Okay, so the cow basically is getting fed and all that. But you could think of cows actually being like bonds. You know how bonds pay coupons all the way along? And then at the end, you get the face value of the bond, and there are no more coupons. What do you think happens to the cow when she stops squirting out milk?
Beef cow now.
Yeah, now she's a beef cow. You've probably eaten her down at McDonald's, and you didn't even realize it, right? You see how that works? Okay, so when we say we're milking the property, basically, we're not investing more money in it. We're just collecting the cash flows off of it instead of trying to engage in activities that are going to improve the value of this thing, not only for the shareholders, but also for the bondholders. So we'll talk about these three kind of scumbag moves. So here is our example of a company in distress. And this is an interesting balance sheet in that it shows both the book value and the market value. And, by the way, assets, cash, what's the relationship between the book value of cash and the market value of cash? Should be the same, right? Unless you're lying about how much cash you've actually got, these should always be the same. Is that true of all assets? No. In fact, here we see the fixed assets have a book value of 400, but they have a market value of 0. Let's see how something can have a market value of 0. Let's say that you have a seafood restaurant in Florida and you have no insurance. And one day you're sitting on assets that are worth 400,000 million, whatever it is, and then a hurricane blows through. The whole thing is gone. What are your assets worth now? 0. Do you guys see how that works? So that's one way. It would be a disaster, or the factory burns down, something like that. And then another way would be obsolescence. So leading up to the introduction of the Apple Watch, I had been treating myself like once every year or so with a new watch. And so people were investing in the equipment to make these higher end watches. But then the Apple Watch comes along. What happens to the demand for higher end watches? Right? What is that now? The book value of the assets that people bought to make those higher end watches are exactly as they were before. But what's happened to the market value of those assets? Yeah, they're down now. And so that's how we could see market value drop dramatically like that. Now, if we add those things together, the book value of the assets are 600, but the market value is only 200. Now let's look at the other side. On the other side, we have, by the way, liabilities, the bonds, and the liabilities plus the equity have to equal what? The assets, right? And so over here on the book values, we have 300 worth of bonds and we have 300 worth of equity for a total $600. So that all matches up. But here's the problem. What's the market value of those assets? 200. And we know that liabilities and owner's equity have to add to the value of the assets. So what's the market value of debt plus equity here? It can only be how much? 200. Now, the next thing we need to know is who gets paid first, debt or equity?
Debt.
Yeah, debt. So that $200, where's it going toward? Is it going toward the debt or the equity?
Debt.
It's going toward the debt. And what's 200 minus 200? What's left over for the shareholders? 0. Even if the market value of the assets had been 300, how much would the shareholders be getting? 0, right? Because all that money would go to the debt holders. Does that make sense? Okay. So, here is selfish strategy number 1. By the way, I'll give you one more big example of the risky undertaking. Do you guys know what a Hail Mary pass is? So yeah, my fantasy football people, what's a Hail Mary pass?
Just throw it like an 80-yard throw.
Yeah, okay. Then let's talk about the situation that leads to that. We're down by 6. And there's like 12 seconds left on the clock. If we continue to play it safe, what's going to happen?
No reward.
Yeah, we're going to lose, right? And so here we go. We've got this one opportunity. We're going to take a crazy, crazy, crazy big risk, chuck the football way down the field, and hope that we can score that way. That's the Hail Mary pass. Now, the Hail Mary pass makes sense because even if it fails, we just end up with the same outcome that we would have had before, which is we lose, right? But hey, smaller percentage chance, but what if it succeeds? Then we might win the game. Does that make sense? You know, assuming you get the extra point. Maybe I'll say we're only down by 5 points, and then we would have it, right? Does that all make sense? Okay, so let's talk about the Hail Mary pass as far as this business goes. So we've got this gamble, and if it works out, we're going to get $1,000. And if it doesn't work out, we get bupkis, nothing, right? Now, what are the probabilities? There's a 10% chance that this thing will pay off, and there's a 90% chance that we're going to lose. By the way, would you take a bet like that? No. But what if you had nothing to lose? And that's where the managers find themselves at, is they've got nothing to lose. Remember, this thing's going to go belly up regardless. And so they're like, yeah, we're going to make this bet. And so the cash investment is $200. By the way, that's all the firm's cash. If we shut down operations today, who would that cash go to?
Debt holder.
Yeah, the debt holders. But instead of doing this, paying that money off to the debt holders, what are we going to do? We're going to spend that money on the big gamble. We're going to spend that money on the big gamble. Now, what is the expected cash flow? Well, let's talk about required return. By the way, what's the relationship between risk and return?
Higher risk equals higher requirement.
Yeah, higher risk requires higher return. And so this 50% required return may look crazy to you, but it actually makes sense given the risk. In fact, when you look at venture capital firms, when they talk about the kind of returns that they want, do they talk about percentages? No, they actually talk about multiples. We're looking to get 12 times our money out of this. And why do they have to get that much? Because these things are so risky. Does that make sense? So this really is not unreasonable to think that there should be a 50% return on this given the risk. So what's our expected cash flow from the gamble? Well, we just take the probability of the win multiplied by the cash flow that happens if we get the win, plus the probability of the loss times the cash flow if we get the loss. So what we're looking at is 10% of 1,000 plus 90% of 0. What's 90% of 0? 0. So all we're really interested in is the 10% of 1,000, and that tells us it's 100. Now, let's talk about what is the NPV for this project. The NPV here, we're going to have to spend $200, and our expected, the present value of that cash flow, the expected cash flow, is 100 divided by 1.5. Why are we dividing by 1.5? Yeah, so 50, it's 50% return, right? And it's 1 plus r to the t power. 1 plus 0.5 to the first power is 1.5. And when we do that, we see that we have a negative $133 NPV project. What's the rule for accepting projects? Yeah, we only accept the positive ones. So what should be our decision on this? Yeah, reject it. But from the shareholders' perspective, are they actually investing their own money at this point? No, that $200 is coming straight from the bondholders. Does this make sense so far? Okay. So what's the expected cash flow from the gamble? Well, for the bondholders, if this gamble pays off, what's the best the bondholders can hope for? That is to be paid in full, right? Because you're not going to pay bondholders extra if this big win happens. So there's a 10% chance that they're going to get paid in full, $300. There is a 90% chance that they won't get squat. And why aren't they getting squat? Because we took that $200 that they were entitled to, and we made this big bet with it. And so the expected value to the bondholders of this gamble, the expected cash flow, is $30. But what is the expected cash flow to the stockholders? Well, 1,000 minus the 300 we have to pay the bondholders in the event of a win multiplied by 0.10. And then 0 if the thing goes belly up. That gives us a expected cash flow to the shareholders of 70. So what's the present value of the bonds without the gamble? The present value of the bonds without the gamble is that full $200 if we just went ahead and gave them their money. But the present value of the stocks without the gamble is 0. Remember, there's nothing left for the shareholders if we don't do the gamble. So let's talk about the present value of the bonds with the gamble. Well, we've got that expected cash flow of 30 divided by 1.5, which is just 1 plus r to the t, right? And that gives us a present value of that gamble of 20. And so our bondholders went from the present value without the gamble of 200, now they're down to a present value of 20. Do you think they're happy that we made the gamble? Absolutely not. Now let's look at it from the stockholders' perspective. The present value of stocks with the gamble is the expected cash flow of 70 divided by 1 plus r to the t, or 1.5, and that leaves us with about $47. What was the present value for the shareholders without the gamble? 0, and now it's $47. What is the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. By taking on this negative NPV project, mathematically, we have actually maximized shareholder wealth. Does that make sense? Isn't that crazy? But these risky times when people are in financial distress, they lead to situations like this. By the way, remember earlier I gave you the example of the bank and the risky loan? I've seen that at least twice in my life. I saw it in the late 70s, I saw it in the late 80s, where people were out there. So the savings and loan crisis was the big example. these savings and loans got in trouble, and the only way they could see their way out was to do the Hail Mary pass. And you know what? It worked for some of them, a small proportion. What happened to the rest? Yeah, the banks went insolvent, and there was a larger loss as a result. Typically, if you see a company heading toward insolvency, would you rather force them into bankruptcy sooner or later? Sooner. They're sitting there burning cash, right? And the sooner you can stop them, the less cash they'll burn. Does that make sense? Now, what's the incentive of the managers? Do they want to put an end to this as soon as possible? No, they want to keep this going because after all, they get paid by the month, right? Does that make sense? Plus, it's really embarrassing when your firm goes bankrupt. What do you think that does to your job prospects? Kind of limits them, doesn't it? Like, oh yeah, please come make our company bankrupt too. No, no one's going to ask you to do that. Questions? Yeah.
I just learned the 300 for the bondholders, that's from the debt on the balance sheet we saw earlier, right?
So,
Okay.
oh. Yeah, those long-term bonds, book value of 300, that's the face value of the bonds. Other questions? Okay, now we're going to talk about underinvestment. And so now we've got this, same firm, we've got this government-sponsored project. And by the way, why do we say government-sponsored? Because when the government's behind it, we assume it is a low-risk kind of thing, right? It guarantees $350 in one period. Now, the cost of investment to do this is going to be $300. How much cash does this firm currently have? Now, forget the gamble. We're moving on, but we're using the same balance sheet here. How much cash do they have on hand? $200. Can they do the entire investment just from the cash they have on hand? No. In order to be able to make this investment, what are the shareholders going to have to do? They're going to have to pony up an additional $100. Right? So here we are, we've got a firm that's on the edge of insolvency, and we're asking our shareholders to pony up another $100. But it might make sense because the NPV of this project, if we look at it, required return, by the way, is 10% because it's a very safe project because it's guaranteed by the government, unlike that big gamble we were just talking about. If you look at the net present value of this, we've got our negative 300 investment plus the present value of that cash flow of $350 a year from now. The NPV is $18.18. What does the rule tell us to do in this case? Should we accept or reject the project? Yeah, we should accept the project. Now, here's the problem. Let's look at the cash flows from the government-sponsored project. If we take it, those bondholders are going to get paid in full. And so they would be happy about that. What are the shareholders going to get? They're going to get 50. So far, though, they were headed for zero. This sounds good. The present value of the bonds without the project, we know that that's 200 because that's the cash we have if we don't take the project. That's what they can get. We know the shareholders have no money if we don't take on the project. And so far it sounds like we should be taking on the project. Let's talk about the present value of the bonds with the project. It's $272.73. How do we get that? That's the present value of that $300 that the bondholders will get if they take on the project. But what is the present value of the stocks with the project? Well, the stockholders are only going to be getting $50. And 50 divided by 1.10 gives us the present value of that cash flow, but we have to subtract that extra $100 that the equity holders had to pony up in order to be able to take on this project. And when we do that, then the present value of the stocks is negative. And so the shareholders would have to throw in an extra 100 in order to get the present value of 50. Does that sound like a good deal to them? No. And so when we see this situation, what happens is positive NPV projects, ones that should have been invested in, don't get invested in. And we call that underinvestment. So that's scumbag strategy number 2 is underinvestment. Questions? So let's talk about milking the property. Do you guys know what a liquidating dividend is? When you sell off all the assets, you pay off the debts, and then you pay the shareholders what's left. Well, you could even go farther than that. You could actually, the firm, if there are no bond covenants preventing it, the firm could actually pay out a $200 dividend to the shareholders. If you're a shareholder, does that sound good? Absolutely. If the firm doesn't pay this out, who is that $200 going to go to? The bond holders. And so this is when the shareholders all get together and say, hey, let's pay ourselves a $200 dividend. Now, you got to be careful because these tactics, you have to look at the bond indentures. By the way, what's the indenture on a bond?
The agreement.
Yeah, it's the agreement. And within the agreement, they have these things called covenants. And one of the covenants that's very popular in bond indentures is the limitation of the amount of dividends that can be paid out, usually limited as a proportion of the earnings per share. In other words, the profits, you can't completely pay them out to the shareholders. And so undoubtedly, $200 here is more than the earnings per share of the firm. The firm's in real trouble, right? And so a good bond covenant would prevent this kind of behavior. But hey, if that covenant's not there, it's perfectly legal for the shareholders to pay themselves this dividend. Remember, people are scumbags, and you have to protect yourself against scumbaggery when you're loaning people money. And one of the things that you insist upon is a covenant that limits them being able to do crap like this. Does that make sense? Okay, the other thing is this. What if we see the writing on the wall, we know this thing is going to hell, let's just have a big party. Let's have a big party, and we managers will invite the shareholders, and we'll have a $200 party. Does it change the amount that the shareholders get to take home at the end of the day? No, they're still getting zero, right? But does it change the amount that the bondholders get to take home? Yeah, they go from they were thinking they were going to get $200, and then they had the big party, and now we're down to zero. By the way, what's a perquisite?
What you said?
What's a perquisite? So you may have heard it as a perk. Say, well, that's a perk of the job, right? For instance, I get to work in this air-conditioned building. This is a perk of my job. It's part of my non-monetary compensation, right? And so there are other perquisites, but that's a very basic one. But think about the company jet. If you are the CEO of this company and you know it's getting ready to go belly up, do you fly the company jet or do you fly first class on commercial? You fly the company jet. Does that make sense? You're gonna get yourself a new company car. Do you get a Chevrolet or a BMW? You get the BMW. Now, by the way, eventually that BMW will be clawed back in the bankruptcy process. But how long does bankruptcy take, baby? It takes a long time. I'm gonna enjoy that BMW while I can. Does that make sense? So this is the kind of scumbaggery that we talk about when we're talking about milking the property. Any questions about milking the property? Okay, so how can these costs of debt be reduced? Now, we've got interest as a cost of debt, but we're talking about these additional costs that are going on here. How can we get people to demand less to loan us money, knowing that people are scumbags? Well, we can come up with covenants. And these are promises not to engage in certain forms of scumbaggery. Promises not to engage in certain forms of scumbaggery. Okay, so let's talk about the first one up here, limits on dividends. Do you remember that scumbag thing where we said we were just going to pay out the dividend to all the shareholders? Well, what if we promised not to do that? What if we promised not to do that? Do you think then those bonds would be less risky for the bondholders? If we could credit, yeah, they'll be less risky. And as a result, what will be the required return from our bondholders? Yeah, it's going to be lower, so that's going to lower our cost of borrowing. Now, by the way, what kinds of things should I promise not to do? Any ideas? You should promise not to do things that you didn't plan on doing anyway, right? And so, for instance, I can easily promise not to cheat on my wife because I have no intention of doing that. Right? It's an easy promise for me to make. If for some reason that were to be less risk for the bondholders, whatever I promise, then they're going to require a lower return. What about not pledging assets to other lenders? Let's talk about the danger of that. Let's say I've got a house, and this house is worth $350,000, and it's totally paid for. And I could go to Mr. Dexheimer and say, Mr. Dexheimer, I've got this house here, it's worth $350,000. Feel free to check that out. Would you be willing to loan me $250,000 versus the value of the house?
Sure.
Yeah, sure we will. And so then I can go to Mr. Ware. Now, Mr. Ware, you did not hear this conversation I just had with him. So by the way, I got my $250,000. I said, Mr. Ware, I got this house, $350,000. Will you loan me $250,000? He says no, because he knows the game, right? But in reality, it's because he just heard this, right? And so he's willing to loan it to me, and so are you. Now, here comes the problem. By the way, if I'm this kind of a scumbag, do you think I'm going to be making the payments on all three of these mortgages? How many payments do you think I'm going to make? Probably none, right? I'm off to Mexico with your $750,000. Now, the first person to show up at my house to claim it is Mr. Dexheimer. Mr. Dexheimer shows up, and he's ringing the doorbell. And then Mr. Ware starts to come up the sidewalk. And Mr. Ware says, or Mr. Dexheimer says, what are you doing here? And Mr. Ware says, by the way, that's your name, right, Ware? He says, by the way, I'm here to get my house. And Dexheimer says, I don't think so. My house now. And right about then, he comes up the sidewalk. And then they both look at him, and he says, I'm here to get my house. Now, what do you think happens on the porch of my house?
I was here first. Spoiler fights.
Right. I think he's bigger than you. Right? It's a three-way fist fight. By the way, this is what a three-way fist fight looks like, right? Three-way fist fight. Now, do you think something similar could happen with people showing up at bankruptcy proceedings, trying to get a share, their rightful share of the assets? Absolutely. And so that's why we say if we've got these assets, we're not going to pledge them to anyone else because it makes the loan more secure. Now, the more security a loan has, the lower the required rate, the lower our cost of borrowing. So there's your second way. Number 3, firms may not merge. Now this one, by the way, not every indenture will have all of these covenants. In fact, some companies' business models require merging. For example, General Electric is always buying and selling businesses. They could never promise not to merge with another firm. They could never do that. But what if you were in a business where you could? Here's why it might be good to bondholders. So let's assume that I have a business where we milk cows, and I sell the milk to the local school district on a fixed profit contract. So no matter what my costs are, they always pay me 10% over, and so I've got this very safe stream of cash flows. You guys might be willing to loan me money at 4%. Now, my brother-in-law has a company that does nuclear waste cleanup. And not only is that a risky kind of job, it's financially risky because when is the next nuclear waste problem going to occur? We don't know. How big is it going to be? We don't know, right? So not only is it radiologically risky, it's financially risky. And so my brother-in-law has some bonds outstanding from you folks at 8%. Now, if my brother-in-law and I, over Thanksgiving, decide to merge our firms, and they're both equal-sized firms, equal amounts of debt, we merge those firms, and now the risk for the merged firms requires a return of 6%. Now, you guys were requiring 8%, now you're requiring 6%. What's the relationship between bond price and yield to maturity?
Inverse.
Yeah, it's inverse. So your yield to maturity went down, so your value of your bonds actually went up. Are you happy? Yeah, right? Who doesn't like extra money? Well, let's talk about you poor folks. Here you were thinking you had safe bonds of 4%, and now suddenly these bonds are required return of 6%. What happens to the value of your bonds? They go down. And in fact, it's a direct wealth transfer from the bondholders of the safe part of the merged firm to the bondholders of the risky part of the merged firm. And that's why, especially this group of people over here, might want me to promise not to merge with another firm. Now, with the risky firm, maybe it's not important for me to put that covenant in the bond because after all, you guys would be thrilled for me to merge with a safer firm. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, firm may not issue more long-term debt. By the way, this one is fairly rare because companies are always borrowing more long-term debt, paying off older long-term debt, things like that. But assume that you could promise not to borrow more long-term debt. Why would that be attractive to bondholders?
You only not owe money to me.
Yeah, if I only owe money to you, the chances of you getting repaid are much higher, right? And as a result, you're going to require less in terms of required return or yield to maturity. And so it makes perfect sense that if I could promise to do that, that would be a good thing for the bondholder and it's going to reduce my costs of borrowing. Another one, and this is pretty standard, must maintain a minimum NWC. What's NWC stand for? Net working capital. Think about net working capital. It's current assets minus current liabilities. At a healthy business, is it positive or negative?
Positive.
Positive. Remember that current assets are things we expect to create cash within a year. Current liabilities are things we expect to consume cash within a year. That darn thing better be positive or we're not going to be able to meet our bills for the coming year. And so we're going to say, look, we're going to keep a minimum of $50 million in net working capital. We promise to do that. Why would that be reassuring to the bondholders? Enough money to pay them. And here's the thing. The bondholders, are they not only worried about themselves getting paid? The trick is the bondholders have to be worried about other people getting paid too. Because any of the people the firm owes money to can force them into bankruptcy, including the suppliers. So I might have sold a zero coupon, or I might have bought a zero coupon bond from you guys. I might not be expecting to get paid for a long, long time, but I would still be thrilled for you to keep a minimum net working capital so your suppliers can't force you into bankruptcy. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we also can promise to provide financial statements to the lenders. And it's not just going to be any financial statement. What kind of financial statements do you think we're going to promise to turn over? Starts with an A. No accountants in here, huh? Audited financial statements. What is an audited financial statement versus a regular one? Yeah, someone has taken a look at it. Now, if we had more time, I would go into the depth of why audits aren't guarantees. But it's better to have an audited financial statement than a non-audited financial statement. By the way, remember that people are scumbags. Do you think people would be beyond giving you false financial statements in order to secure a loan? Absolutely not. So I have a contact who is a business broker, and people come in all the time with their financial statements wanting to sell their business. Do you think they have an incentive to pretty up the financial statements? Absolutely they do. And so what my contact always says is, you can keep your financial statements. What I want to see is your tax return. By the way, these are small companies, so do you think their financial statements are audited? No. But who are they more likely to lie to? The person they're trying to sell the business to, or the government? Yeah, the potential customer. Why are they less likely to lie to the government? They don't want to go to jail, right? By the way, we've talked about how bad prison is, right? Okay, so I don't have to go there again. But if you can't get audited financial statements, start looking for tax statements because they're less likely to lie. The point here is people will lie for money the same way they will lie for chocolate or sex or anything else, right? And so we want to try to do as many things as we can to limit the ability for people to lie. That's why we want audited financial statements. Now, why is it important for us as lenders to have the financial statements? How in the world would I know if they were living up to their promise to maintain a minimum net working capital if I didn't have their financial statements? I basically just have to take their word for it, right? And so that's why these financial statements are important. We have to use them to be able to determine that they're meeting all the other requirements. Plus, we just generally want to know the financial condition of the firm. Okay, so those are all ways that we can make our bondholders feel safer, so they will require a lower return that will lower our cost of borrowing. Another one we can do is debt consolidation. So everybody in here, I borrow money from everybody in here, and then I go bankrupt. What do you all have to do now? If you want any money at all, what do you have to do? You have to go out and hire a lawyer. And so we've got, 16 people in this class? 16 lawyers. But what if instead I had only borrowed the money from Mr. Bash? Now I've got the entire amount from him. How many lawyers does he have to hire? One. Do you see we've got a reduction of 15 lawyers as a result of consolidating all the debt with one lender? Does that make sense? Okay. Questions?
I know you said it doesn't happen very often, but like when it comes to the covenant of like not issuing more long-term debt, wouldn't new long-term debt be junior to the debt outstanding?
Okay, so now you're getting into something that hopefully you should have talked about in 380, 390, and that is seniority. And you basically would have to have it, I think, in the indenture, explaining the indenture of the new stuff, saying that it was junior to the old debt. Or you could have it in the indenture for the old debt that if we issue more, then it will be junior. But I would still be more pleased if you said you weren't going to borrow any more money at all. Other questions? You were playing word association. I say questions, you say answers. I say dog, you say? He's not very
More
good.
dogs.
More dogs. He's not good at word association. Okay, let's talk about tax effects and financial distress. So we've got the tax effects of debt. We know that there's a debt tax shield. That is protecting our profits from taxes. On the other hand, we have this financial distress. And we're talking about the expected cost of financial distress. And as always, when we're talking about expected cost, we're talking about the percentage probability times how much it's going to cost if it really happens. And so this whole idea is that we are trading these two things off. And so you might think that there would be some sort of formula that we could come up with that would tell us exactly the optimal capital structure for a firm, such that one additional dollar in debt will get us the exact same amount of tax benefit from the shield that it's going to increase our expected cost of financial distress. You might think that that was possible, but I'm going to tell you it's not. And it's not possible for a couple of reasons. First of all, can we know for sure what is the probability of financial distress? No. Number two, remember I told you that we can probably quantify the direct costs of bankruptcy, but can we quantify those indirect costs? No. And so we truly cannot put a good number on the expected cost of financial distress. I would love to be able to show you guys that there was a neat, slick formula for this, but the good news is that means I'm not going to ask you to do any calculations with this, right? So no calculations from this slide. Now let's talk about this from a graphic standpoint here. So on the horizontal axis we have the debt, and on the vertical axis we have the value of the firm. And remember, if we look at Modiani and Miller with corporate taxes, then we have the blue line, where the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the present value of the tax shield. And the present value of the tax shield is the tax rate times the amount of debt. And so because we're multiplying directly by the amount of debt there, that's why this thing is a line, because it's a linear relationship. And so that value under Modiani and Miller with corporate taxes and debt, that line is just a straight blue line. Now, what would be the value of the unlevered firm? We've just got that straight line down below. Notice it doesn't change with the amount of debt because after all, the debt is zero, right? So where does the true value of the firm lie? Somewhere in between. So here's what happens. In the beginning, when I take on a little bit of debt, do I get the tax benefit from that tax shield? Yes. Have I significantly raised the probability of financial distress? No. Now the cost of financial distress, if it does happen, is always the same. But what we're messing with here, by the way, does it make sense that the more debt we have, the higher the probability of financial distress? If you got two people, one of them has zero debt, and one of them has $400,000 in debt, who's more likely to go bankrupt? The one with $400,000. In fact, the one with zero can't go bankrupt at all, right? And so if the one with zero borrows $10, they can write the interest off of that $10, but has it really increased that much, their probability of financial distress? And the answer is no. And so for a while there, we cruise along with the actual value of the firm pretty closely matching to the value of the firm with taxes, debt, and taxes. But at some point, we reach where that probability starts to climb, and our expected cost of financial distress goes up, and then that curve starts to, at first it doesn't start to go down, but it does start to go up less quickly. You see that? It's going to decelerate, and then at some point it's going to hit a maximum. It's going to hit a maximum value of the firm. And we say that the capital structure that is underneath that maximum firm value, B star, that is our optimal amount of debt. That's the optimal amount of debt in the capital structure. If you're any higher than that, the firm is worth less. If you're any lower than that, the firm is worth less. And so this leads us to the conclusion that every firm has an optimal capital structure. If you're not at that optimal capital structure, you are not maximizing the value of the firm. If you are not maximizing the value of the firm, are you maximizing shareholder wealth? No, remember back to chapter 14, one of the first things we said was, if we're going to maximize shareholder wealth, we need to maximize the value of the firm because the shareholders are the residual claimants, right? And so what we're saying here is if you're living out the goal of financial management, you're going to be seeking out what this target financial capital structure is, and you're going to be trying to stay at it. Does that make sense? And that's why I tell you on BSG, I think it's what, 39% debt, 61% equity was what you started out with? That's a pretty strong hint that that is your target capital structure. You're going to maximize the value of the firm when you're at the target capital structure. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about this before we move on? How many optimal capital structures are there for a firm? Typically, is the 99.999% debt going to be optimal? No. Is 0.1% debt going to be optimal, typically? No. We'll talk about some cases in which it would be, though. So let's go back to the pie model. So in the beginning, we had this pie. And we said it was the bondholders plus the shareholders, and that was the value of the firm. And it really didn't matter how we divvied it up between those two. The value of the firm would stay the same. And then we started throwing in taxes. And we added another piece to the pie. We had not only the bondholders and the shareholders, but now we had the government. And now the capital structure does make a difference for the value of the firm, B plus S, because if we can minimize that government slice by using our tax shield, then we can actually increase the value of the firm, B plus S. Now, what we're saying is it's not just B and S and the government, the debt holders, the equity holders, and the government. Now we're going to throw in L for lawyers. We're going to throw in L for lawyers. And so we might have said that, well, we're going to have more debt to reduce the government side. But what's that going to do to our expected cost for lawyers? That's going to raise it up. And so what we're going to try to do is put our capital structure in such a way that we minimize G plus L. So not only am I I'm not just trying to minimize my taxes, I'm trying to minimize my taxes plus the expected cost of financial distress. And when I do that, then I've maximized the claims of B and S, the debt holders and the shareholders. Okay, here's the problem. As debt goes up, we know G goes down. But what happens to L? It goes up. So you say, whoa, I don't want to have to deal with those lawyers, so I'm going to reduce my debt. Great, L goes down. What happens to G? Right? But there is a balance. There is an optimum. You remember that B star? That B star is where we have minimized G plus L. Questions? Okay, just in case you're visual learners, here's what we just said, only in a picture. The firm not only has the bondholder claims and the shareholder claims, but it also has the tax claims, that's what we were calling G. And it also has the bankruptcy claims, which we were calling L. So that's just a graphic representation of that. Now let's talk about something else that might be going on with debt. If I am a CEO, I would like to be able to let people know that things were going great at the firm and that we had high expected future cash flows. But if I go on television and just say, oh, things are great at the firm and we have high expected future cash flows, should you believe me? No! In fact, I have watched CEOs on Bloomberg, CNBC, and this will be like after the closing bell, so it's like 4:30 Eastern time, and they're like, oh yeah, everything's great, and we're just really looking forward to the future, and we're making some really big strides here, and yeah, things are rocky a little bit right now, but we know that the future looks great. And then that same CEO at 12:01 a.m. has his CFO entering their bankruptcy petition to the federal courts via the online portal. Was he telling the truth at 4:30? No. People are scumbags. People lie. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, therefore, the only way that I can signal our situation is if I do it such that it's costly and it can't be replicated by losers. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's take humans, for example. If you wanted, so let's say you're rolling up on your 10th high school reunion. And so you want to signal to your classmates that you're doing well. But in truth, you're unloading trucks at Macy's. So what do? Well, you go out and you borrow a lot of money at a high interest rate because after all, you're risky. And you buy a Porsche 911. And you drive it to your high school reunion. You have a really good time. Now the question is this. Can you maintain that signal? Guys, unloading trucks at Macy's. Do you think he's making enough to pay for this high interest loan payments on this Porsche 911? By the way, that car costs more than $100,000, right? He can't sustain that signal. And we see the same thing with loser companies. They can't sustain this signal of borrowing money. So when you borrow money, you are putting yourself under a fixed repayment scheme. And so you're basically, when you go out and borrow money, the signal is, hey, I can afford to make these payments over and over and over again. What does that say about your cash flow? Yeah, it's good, right? If your cash flow wasn't good, though, like Mr. Dexheimer, then you couldn't afford to do that. And so the signal wouldn't last very long. And so what we see is then that basically recursively gets us back to companies basically don't take on the debt unless they do have a good financial situation. Or they're in really, really bad shape, right? And they're trying the Hail Mary pass. So if you've got a company that you know stinks and they go out and try to borrow money, that doesn't really tell you anything positive, right? But for most companies, if you have know their information and they have been doing well and they go out to borrow money, that's a good sign.
Can new stock issuance also be like a sign of that?
Oh yeah, we're going to get to that. Absolutely, we're going to get to that. Okay, so investors view this debt as a signal of firm value. And so you'll see that this is a way that managers can signal. And so this is something in addition to this trade-off that may be obscuring what the true optimal capital structure is, because companies may borrow a little more than optimal just to signal to the market that they're doing well. By the way, why would the CEO want to signal to the market that the company's doing well? What happens to the share price? Share price goes up. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize the shareholder wealth. How do I do that? I make the share price go up, right? Does that make sense? And so we might actually have a little more debt than we mathematically should under the trade-off theory, simply because we're using that debt to signal that we are doing well. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we talked about this. A manager that takes on more debt than optimal, in order to fool investors, they're going to pay the cost in the long run because they cannot maintain that costly signal. The cost is the interest payments every month. Now, you may not realize it. We've talked before about agency problem and about how people are rationally self-interested. And one of the things, first things that I'm going to point out to you is that individuals will work harder for the firm if they're one of the owners of the firm. They'll work harder if they're one of the owners than if they were just a hired hand. Let me give you an example. I had a guy that worked for me in Dallas, Texas. His name was Roy, and he was a top paid machinist at the shop. And whenever Roy worked for me, here's how Roy would walk from one workstation to another. He was very relaxed. I just thought he was really laid back. It was Texas, right? Just figured he was cool. One weekend, my wife and I are out driving around. We happen to drive past Roy's house. And Roy is in his driveway working on his hot rod. And here's what it looked like. He's moving much faster. I slammed on the brakes. My wife said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Something's wrong with Roy. I have never seen him move that fast in all the time we spent together." Now, when Roy was working for me, who got the benefits of his efforts? I did. All Roy had to do was work hard enough for me not to fire him, and he would keep getting his $17.88 an hour. When he's working on the weekend, who gets 100% of the benefit of his labor? Well, he does, right? And so people work harder for themselves than they do for others. Now let's talk about managers. Managers, they have this motive to partake in perquisites. We talked about perquisites earlier, right? And so this is where I'd like to have a cushier office. I'd like to have a bigger private plane. These are the perquisites of being the job. And so, but they may not have an opportunity because there has to be money laying around in order for them to be able to waste it. Does that make sense? And so this extra money that's laying around we call free cash flow. The free cash flow is if we take the money that's coming in and we make all of our interest payments and all of our debt payments, and we also undertake all of the positive NPV projects, anything that's left over is called free cash flow. If there's zero free cash flow, how much money can the managers waste? None, right? The problem is if we have too much cash laying around, though, managers start to look for ways to use it, and they're not using it in the benefit of shareholder. By the way, who does the free cash flow belong to? Shareholders, right? Shareholders own the company. They're the residual claimants. So the free cash flow belongs to the shareholders, not to the managers. And so what we should be seeing in this situation, if we have this free cash flow, is that free cash flow should be going to one of two things. And it should either be going to dividends or share repurchases. It should be going to dividends or share repurchases. So dividends is where we mail out a check every 3 months to the shareholders because after all, it's their money. Share repurchases is where we buy back shares from shareholders and we reduce the overall equity of the firm, we reduce the number of shares, and so we have given money back to the shareholders in that way. By the way, when we go out and buy more shares, what does that do to share price? Right? Okay, so a good manager is returning the free cash flow to the shareholders through one of these two methods. By the way, which one of those is a more credible signal of future cash flows? It turns out that it's dividends, because dividends are what we call sticky, because firms are reluctant to raise dividends until they're positive that they'll be able to continue that level of dividends. And here's why. If you raise your dividends, your share price goes up a little. What happens if you cut your dividends? Your share price goes down a lot, right? It's what we call an asymmetric reaction. It's an asymmetric reaction. So if you raise it, you're going to get a little pat on the back, and if you cut it, you're going to get a big kick in the ass. Do you see how that works? And so this means managers are not going to be willing to raise dividends until they have a good picture of these enhanced cash flows happening perpetually, right? Now, what if I get some extra money, but I'm not sure that it's going to continue? Then I would undertake a share repurchase. And so it turns out that a share repurchase, while it is a good sign from the standpoint that the managers are forswearing wasting that money, it's not as good a sign as increasing the dividends, but they're both positive signs. Now, what if we have managers that are not properly paying out dividends or repurchasing shares? We might actually want for those managers to take on additional debt and buy back shares. And the reason we would want to, or we to take on additional debt, that additional interest is going to increase the fixed payments that the firm has. We get the tax shield of debt, and it reduces the amount of money that's left over for the managers to waste. And so in that way, we see that debt can actually be a constraint on managerial perquisite consumption. I see firms like Apple. Apple has less debt in their capital structure than they should. That means that they've got more free cash flow than they should. They end up doing things like building that huge spaceship kind of headquarters. Have you guys seen that out in California? It's like a big freaking donut. Now, if you want to talk about wasteful architecture, here's the way you can really waste architecture. You build a building that's got this huge diameter, but you only put offices around the very edge of it, and you have this huge wasted space in the middle. By the way, this is in Silicon Valley, California. Do you think that's cheap real estate? No. That real estate that's in the middle of that building is probably worth more than all the buildings here at Missouri State. That's wasteful. Where did they get the money? Free cash flow. What would be something that shareholders should do through the board of directors? They should implore them to get Apple to take on more debt and use the money to buy back shares in order to reduce that free cash flow that those managers are using in wasteful ways. Does that make sense? By the way, is Apple the only company that does that? No. You see all these Google things, these things that have absolutely nothing to do with search engine, like self-driving cars and things like that? Do you think some of that comes from the fact that they have huge free cash flow and that they're just out having a good time? Yeah, absolutely. Questions?